Rob Ashton, thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So it was interesting to hear you describe yourself as not being a politician, yet ironically, you're running for one of the most political jobs in this country. What gives?
I got tired. I got tired of Polyev pretending that he's a worker, and I got tired of bankers running our country, to be honest with you. And I wanted the working class to have a voice again, a voice back in Ottawa. And what better voice than being the leader of the federal NDP?
And you say you got tired. Was that from your position as a union leader that you were getting frustrated that the issues that you wanted championed were not being championed by the people you thought should be?
I got tired of just about everybody in Ottawa ignoring the working class in this country. I got tired of liberal and conservative politicians pretending they're going to represent the workers, and all they do is represent their working class friends, or their ruling class friends, sorry. Um, and and I think the NDP lost its way a little bit, or lost its way to communicating and listening to the working class of this country. Because in the last parliament, we scored three amazing victories, and the Liberals ate our lunch on it.
Okay, the Liberals ate their lunch, but that sounds like the NDP not campaigning enough on its message rather than failing the working class.
And you're true on that. But when I say the Liberals ate our lunch, it's they got out there first. They're the ones that had their voices heard, and they the ones that pretended that they wanted this to happen. When in actual fact, dental care, pharmacare, and anti-scab legislation has been three key points of the NDP platform for decades. And if it wasn't for the supply and confidence agreement, we would never have gotten those.
So supplying confidence, but that goes to the last parliament. I'm wondering, because again, this is one of your clarion calls that you think the NDP needs to get back to the working class, reconnect with the working class. Beyond the messaging around the supply and confidence agreement and the three priorities that were accomplished, how else has the party not been speaking for the working class?
Um, I think over the term, the Section 107s that were being dumped on the unionized workforces across this country federally really hurt the NDP's stance within some unions, especially the ones that were hurt by it. But Leah Gazan and the federal NDP putting forward legislation to remove Section 107 of the Labor Code helped quite a bit to regain the federal unions' positionings within the NDP.
Yeah, and explain that. Section 107?
So Section 107 is ultimately when the Minister of Labor, or nowadays the Minister of Jobs, single-handedly by a stroke of a pen can wipe out workers' rights to withdraw their labor and actually be able to freely negotiate with their employers. And it sends the workforce back to work through binding arbitration. And what that does is that emboldens employers not to negotiate with the workforce. And it gives the employers a bit of an upper hand against, actually, more than a bit of an upper hand against the workers they're negotiating with.
Except that, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, and that party, that leader, they have benefited by appealing to the working class, but they're not talking about labor rights. What they talk about are affordability, housing, bringing down prices by cutting taxes. How does the working class you're talking about actually jive with the working class that's supporting the Conservatives right now?
So Pierre is pretty slick, and he's good with one punch messaging. But any type of substance that he pretends there is in his messaging, there is none. When they allegedly build homes, it's their rich developer friends that get rich off it, and working class Canadians don't see the benefit. So our plan, when we talk about building homes, we talk about building not-for-profit co-op style housing in the same fashion we did after World War II, where it was mass development of these homes that give Canadians an ability to live in affordable housing. And when it comes to like food affordability, we would like to start capping the price of essential groceries so that families aren't having to buy craft dinner instead of something a bit more healthy, if you know what I mean. Uh, and jobs. Our jobs plan is quite simply, if we're going to invest into corporations, like in the auto industry or in the steel mills, then that money that we give them, it'll be tied to job creation, like what happened with the provincial NDP in Halifax in about 2011, where they've helped fund with the federal government, Irving Shipyards, but the money was tied to job creation, and that place went from 300 jobs in 2011 to approximately 3,000 jobs today, and roughly around 14,000 indirect jobs. The other part of our jobs platform is to build, copy what they did in Irving in the East Coast, do that in the West Coast and Central Canada, and build infrastructure, build hospitals, build schools, build homes to put Canadians to work.
Hmm. Well, you know, with jobs in mind and the working class in mind, I do also wonder about your take on the Prime Minister's response to the threats against the Canadian economy. Of course, those threats coming from the Trump White House, the Prime Minister putting his energies into forging new partnerships, new trade relationships. Is that effort worthy of praise or critique when you think about the working class?
Well, when it comes to the United States, the only way you deal with a bully is with absolute strength. And I learned that in grade seven, the hard way, by sticking up for somebody that was a lot smaller than me that was getting picked on. And that's how you deal with bullies, is if they flex their muscles, we equally flex. And when it comes to trade agreements and tariffs in the United States, if it's not a good deal for Canada, we can't sign a deal because our nation lived a very good life before trade deals were coming along, and that was brought in by governments before us. And so I don't think we'd sign any trade deal with the Americans just because we think we have to have a trade deal with them. When it comes to trade agreements with other nations, sure, let's get into trade agreements with other nations, but make sure they work for Canadians.
Okay.
So no more offshoring of jobs.
So, are you willing to walk away from CUSMA? Because that will be a very significant review already underway. It gets really full force come July. Are you willing to walk away from CUSMA?
If it's not a good deal for Canada, then it's not a good deal for the Canadian workers.
So, you're willing to say it should die if it's not good overall, or doesn't not the what Canada wants overall?
If it doesn't work for Canada, then it doesn't work.
Okay. Let's also talk about climate because you describe the climate crisis as a class war. What do you mean by that?
When you look at, well, I come from British Columbia. We burn 4 months of the year, and it seems like the fire season gets longer and our winters get shorter. Quebec floods. Fort Mac almost burnt off the map a few years back. And so what happens is we get these corporations that come in and, for all intents and purposes, destroy the land that we live on. And then they walk away with pocket full of money. And the government of Canada, the ruling class governments that we have in power right now, don't seem to give a flying patootie. Um, and the people that are left behind to suffer the consequences are the working class. It's the citizens of those communities that have to put up with poisoned water or have to put up with fires burning around us. And and they're the ones that are forced to live with it because the corporation just up and move when the job is done.
So, how would you address then climate? Because I know on your website you talk about things like championing an east-west clean energy grid. You also talk about a publicly owned high-speed rail that would traverse the country. But right now, you know, the focus seems very much on getting another pipeline built to the West Coast because Asian countries want that form of Canadian energy. Do you risk, you know, having to choose between the environment or, in your parlance, the working class by prioritizing jobs in a project that we know there's a market for right now?
I don't think we know there's a market for this pipeline. This was a backdoor shady deal done by the Premier of Alberta and the Prime Minister of the country. They never discussed any of this deal with Indigenous nations. They never discussed the deal with British Columbia. They never discussed the deal with any communities along the road. Enbridge won't even touch this deal. So this pipeline that Smith wants to build is just a pipe dream at the end of the day, because nobody wants to touch it except for her and apparently Carney.
So, what about national unity implications? Because we know that Alberta will be Albertans rather, will be voting in referenda come October. Can you or any other leadership hopeful oppose a pipeline without alienating Alberta voters?
I I think we can because we have to look at other energy sources, number one, to look at boosting up the job market, not only in Alberta, but the rest of the country. And you got to remember, Alberta isn't just oil fields. Alberta has manufacturing. Alberta has a ton of farms in that province. So it's not just an oil field province. There's much more industries, and we have to look at expanding those industries and rebuilding some that might be failing.
Do you start from, from 5 steps back though? Because in many ways, the argument you make about switching away from an oil pipeline, looking to a clean energy grid, those seem to be not priorities right now. They don't seem to be front and center in people's minds. Does it take too much time to kind of back up, get people on side, and at the same time maybe hurt the Canadian workers?
No, because the two can go together. So I'm not saying like oil fields all have to shut down, mines all have to shut down, because that just doesn't make sense for the working class in this country. And because the only way we actually make climate change work, or how we win the climate war, is with workers being brought along. And so what I mean by that is, yeah, we keep mining, we keep moving oil out of our ground. But as we do this, the Canadian government has to create the energy field of tomorrow, the green energy economy of tomorrow. And then we have to own it. And I don't mean own it till it becomes profitable and sell it off for a buck. I mean own it till the end of our days. Because we should have did that with Petro-Canada. We should have did that with our airlines and our railway lines. But unfortunately, ruling class governments want to privatize everything in this country to the detriment of the Canadian working class.
Mm-hmm. Listen, I started the Alberta conversation by referencing national unity, and I want to stay on national unity because while it's not on the books officially, Quebec could be facing another referendum. The Parti Québécois certainly wants to make that happen if they win the provincial election come October. Of all the candidates, Avi Lewis arguably has the greatest comfort in French, but he himself admits he still needs to improve. And when you look at the rest of the field, no one really has fluency in French. So if Quebec does hold another referendum, and if you become the NDP leader, how is it possible for you to make the case for Canada without a stronger command of the French language?
So I've never thought of leadership as one person. My organization that I'm the president of, the International Longshore Warehouse Union of Canada here on the West Coast, we're a rank and file membership driven organization. And that means I'm not the only voice. I might be the spokesperson in circumstances with the media, but we get direction from the members. And from that point, we have a team that delivers that message. And that's the same thing when it comes to being leader of the NDP is, just because I'm leader of the NDP doesn't mean it's my way or the highway. It's going to become a membership driven organization when I'm leader. And how do we work in Quebec when my French isn't there yet, but it's coming? I'm learning. It is a tough language to learn, but it's a beautiful language. We have to understand, for me, the culture of Quebec, or as much of it as I can. And so you think of the Quebec people and what they've struggled through. And when it comes to the Quiet Revolution, where the citizens of Quebec had to wrestle away their healthcare and their education from the church so that they could put it into their hands where it rightfully belongs. And the fact that English was the language of the ruling class in Quebec and French was the language of the working class in Quebec. This is the type of stuff that we have to remember, that Quebec is full of a rich history. And so we'll utilize our resources in Quebec, and we'll utilize our Francophone resources to get our message across that a unified Canada is the only Canada that works. Now, having said that, the voices of the Québécois will prevail, and hopefully it'll be to stay unified as one nation.
Mm-hmm. Listen, before we're done, you and I are speaking as the United States engages in a war against Iran. The Prime Minister's immediate response to the start of that war was to back the United States. He made the argument that hitting the Iranian regime prevented Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. He also made the argument that it prevented the regime from, further threatening international peace and security. Then added a few days later that the backing came with regret because it was evidence that the rules-based order was breaking down once again. What's your response, your assessment of what we'd heard from Mark Carney?
Our prime minister's responses to the situation has been sad at best. Um, what we see the United States and Israel doing in Iran is nothing but breaking international law. Yes, the Iranian regime has been murdering their people for the last 50 years in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, which is horrific, and nobody should be standing for it. But I don't think that gives any other country a right to come in and destroy another country. If the citizens of Iran want to uh, to get rid of their government, they will, and they've been struggling to do that. But we've seen what the U.S. administration did in Venezuela. We see what's happening in Gaza, and we see what's happening with Russia invading Ukraine. It's when the powerful decide that they can invade and take over the weak. And that's a problem because if we don't stand up to that as a nation, if we don't stand up and truly stand up for international law, we're just sitting, going along for the ride and being okay with it. And like I said before, I'm not okay with bullies. We have to stand up to bullies. And even if that means pissing the odd person off.
Rob Ashton, I appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you. I appreciate all the time you've given me today.